Richard Anderson stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office in downtown Minneapolis, watching the first snowfall of the season dust the city streets below. The skyline of Minneapolis stretched before him, a testament to the empire he'd built from nothing. His technology company, Anderson Innovations, had just closed another record-breaking quarter, yet the victory felt hollow. Behind him, a framed magazine cover proclaimed him Minnesota's tech titan, but lately that title felt more like a burden than an achievement. His son's wheelchair sat empty in the corner of his home office, a constant reminder of the responsibility he was struggling to bear. Benjamin, or Ben as everyone called him, had been born with a rare condition affecting his mobility. At 10 years old, he required constant care and attention, something Richard had never learned to provide. His wife had managed everything until she left them both 2 years ago, unable to cope with Richard's obsession with work and emotional distance. That morning, like every morning, Richard's housekeeper had helped Ben get ready for school. The boy's bright blue eyes, so much like his mother's, had looked up at Richard hopefully as he passed the breakfast table, but Richard had barely managed a nod before rushing out the door. The guilt of that moment now gnawed at him as he watched the snow continue to fall. His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Mr. Anderson, the board is waiting in the conference room." Richard straightened his tie, his reflection in the window showing a man who seemed to have everything, except the ability to be the father his son needed. The weight of his inadequacy pressed down on him with each step toward the conference room. The meeting dragged on for hours, filled with profit projections and expansion plans. Richard's mind kept drifting to Ben, who would be waiting at home with the housekeeper, probably working on his homework or watching the snow from his wheelchair, just as lonely as Richard felt in this room full of people. That evening, as Richard's driver navigated the increasingly snowy streets toward his Wayzata mansion, he received yet another email from Ben's school. His son's teacher, Miss Johnson, had been trying to schedule a meeting about Ben's struggling performance and increasing withdrawal from his classmates. Richard deleted the email just as he had deleted the previous 3. The mansion loomed ahead, its vast emptiness making Richard's chest tighten. As he entered, he heard Ben practicing his violin, the one activity that seemed to bring his son joy. The melancholic notes floated through the house, each one striking Richard like an accusation. "Dad?" Ben's voice called out as Richard passed his room. Could you come listen to the new piece I learned?" Richard paused, his hand gripping the doorframe. The hope in his son's voice made his heart ache. He should go in. He knew he should. But the sight of Ben in his wheelchair, the daily reminder of all the ways Richard had failed as a father, was too much to bear. "I have an important call, Ben. Maybe another time." The violin music stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. That night, Richard sat in his study, a glass of scotch in his hand, staring at old photos on his phone. Ben as a baby, before they knew about his condition. Ben on his 5th birthday, still able to take a few steps with support. Ben at 7, the day they got his first wheelchair. Each image was a milestone marking their descent into this current reality. The next morning brought more snow and a decision that had been forming in Richard's mind like ice crystals on a window pane. He couldn't do this anymore. He couldn't bear the weight of his own inadequacy, couldn't face the daily reminder of his failures as a father. The solution, terrible as it was, seemed to crystallize in his mind with devastating clarity. That afternoon, instead of heading to the office, Richard instructed his driver to take Ben for a drive. "He needs some fresh air," he had said, helping his son into the car. Ben had smiled, thinking this was finally the attention he'd been craving from his father. As they drove through the outskirts of Minneapolis, past the suburban sprawl and into the more remote areas of Minnesota, Richard felt his resolve hardening like the frozen ground beneath their tires. He had already made arrangements, a prestigious boarding school in Europe, paperwork ready, a clean break. But first, he had to do the unthinkable. He asked the driver to stop at a gas station, claiming Ben needed to use the restroom. While the driver helped Ben, Richard made a call that would set his plan in motion. His hands trembled as he ended the call, knowing that what he was about to do would change everything forever. Sarah and Michael Peterson's auto repair shop sat on the outskirts of Minneapolis, where the city gradually gave way to more open spaces. The small garage had been their livelihood for the past 15 years, and while they weren't wealthy, They had built a comfortable life together. That snowy November evening, they were closing up shop later than usual, thanks to a rush of customers preparing their vehicles for the winter weather. "That's the last one for today," Michael announced, wiping his hands on a shop rag as he finished with a customer's brake repair. Sarah looked up from the scheduling book she was updating, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. "Good thing, too. This storm's picking up," she said, glancing out the workshop window at the swirling snow. The weather forecast had predicted one of the season's first major snowstorms, and the darkening sky suggested they were right. As they prepared to leave, Sarah's attention was drawn to something unusual through the whiteout conditions. "Michael," she called out, squinting through the falling snow. "Do you see that, by the side of the road?" Michael joined her at the window, following her gaze. Through the curtain of snow, they could make out what appeared to be a wheelchair, partially buried in the growing snowdrift. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she realized there was someone in it. Without hesitation, they both rushed outside into the biting cold. As they approached, they found a young boy, no more than 10 years old, huddled in the wheelchair. His clothes were expensive, but not nearly warm enough for the weather, and his lips had taken on a worrying bluish tinge. "Oh my God," Sarah gasped, immediately shrugging off her coat to wrap around the boy. "Honey, he's freezing. We need to get him inside now." Michael carefully lifted the boy from the wheelchair while Sarah grabbed the chair itself, and they hurried back to the warmth of their shop. The boy was conscious but barely responsive, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. Inside, they cleared off the small couch in their office where they sometimes napped during busy seasons. Sarah ran to get the emergency blankets they kept in their first aid kit, while Michael turned up the heat. "Can you tell us your name, sweetheart?" Sarah asked gently, wrapping another blanket around the boy's shoulders. His blue eyes, though tired, met hers with a mix of fear and relief. "Ben," he managed through chattering teeth. "Benjamin Anderson." Sarah and Michael exchanged worried glances. Anderson was a common enough name in Minneapolis, but there was something about the quality of Ben's clothes and the sophisticated design of his wheelchair that suggested this wasn't just any Anderson. "Ben, where are your parents?" Michael asked, keeping his voice calm and steady despite the alarm he felt. "How did you end up out here?" The boy's eyes welled with tears, and he shook his head slightly, unable or unwilling to answer. Sarah's maternal instincts kicked into overdrive, and she pulled him closer, rubbing his arms to help warm him up. "It's okay, sweetheart. You don't have to talk about it right now. Let's just get you warm first." While Sarah tended to Ben, Michael stepped away to call the police, but the storm had knocked out cell service in their area. The landline was dead too. They were effectively cut off until the storm passed. As the evening wore on, Ben gradually warmed up and became more alert. Sarah made hot chocolate from the packets they kept in their break room, and Michael found some leftover cookies from their last customer appreciation day. The boy accepted both with tentative gratitude, his eyes darting between them as if trying to decide whether he could trust them. "You have a nice shop," Ben said quietly, looking around the office. His gaze lingered on the family photos on Sarah's desk, pictures of her and Michael at various classic car shows, their nieces and nephews at family gatherings, the shop's grand opening 15 years ago. "Thank you," Sarah smiled warmly. "Michael's grandfather taught him everything about cars, and now we help keep everyone in the neighborhood moving." Ben's eyes lit up slightly. He started, then stopped himself, his face falling. "I used to watch the mechanics work on our cars. They never let me get too close, though." Sarah and Michael shared another look, both noting how Ben had cut himself off when mentioning his father. Something was very wrong here, but they knew better than to push too hard too fast. As the storm raged outside, they made Ben as comfortable as possible. Sarah remembered they had a few board games stashed in the break room for slow days, and soon they were engaged in a competitive game of Monopoly. The boy's intelligence showed through as he skillfully navigated the game's strategy, and occasional smiles began to break through his reserved exterior. "You're really good at this," Michael commented as Ben collected rent on Boardwalk. "Do you play a lot?" "Sometimes by myself," Ben replied, then added more quietly, "Dad was usually too busy." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt her heart breaking for this child who clearly carried more hurt than any 10-year-old should have to bear. As the evening progressed, they learned that Ben was also a talented musician, particularly fond of the violin, though he mentioned this almost apologetically, as if expecting his interests to be dismissed. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and the wind howled around the corners of the shop. But inside, surrounded by the warmth of the heaters and the gentle attention of Sarah and Michael, Ben began to show glimpses of the bright, engaging child he could be when feeling safe and accepted. The storm that had brought Ben into Sarah and Michael Peterson's lives lasted 3 days, effectively cutting off their part of the city from the rest of Minneapolis. During that time, something remarkable happened in the warmth of their small auto repair shop. They became a family. By the time the roads were cleared and communication was restored, Sarah and Michael had learned more about Ben's story through gentle conversations and patient listening. The boy spoke of lonely dinners with housekeepers, of a father who couldn't look him in the eye, and of a mother who had left when he was 8. He didn't directly tell them about being left in the snow, but they could piece together enough to understand that this wasn't a simple case of a child wandering off. When the police finally arrived, Ben's fear was palpable. His small hands gripped Sarah's sleeve as Officer Collins interviewed them all. The story that emerged through police investigation painted a disturbing picture. Richard Anderson had been seen driving away from the area where Ben was found, and security cameras had captured footage of his car speeding back toward Minneapolis. The ensuing weeks were a whirlwind of social services meetings, legal consultations, and emotional conversations. Richard Anderson made no attempt to contact authorities about his missing son, instead boarding a flight to Singapore for an alleged business emergency. His absence spoke volumes, and the court system moved swiftly to protect Ben's interests. Sarah and Michael, who had never been able to have children of their own, didn't hesitate when asked if they would consider becoming Ben's foster parents. Their modest 3-bedroom home above the auto shop wasn't luxurious, but it was filled with something Ben had never known in his father's mansion: unconditional love. "We'll need to make some adjustments," Michael said one evening, measuring doorways and sketching plans for ramps. He had already started researching accessibility modifications and reaching out to contractor friends for help. Sarah focused on making their home comfortable for Ben in other ways. She cleared out their spare room, painting it in warm blues and greens after Ben mentioned they were his favorite colors. She found brackets to display his violin prominently on the wall, giving his beloved instrument a place of honor. The transition wasn't without its challenges. Ben would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, disoriented and calling out for his father. Sarah would sit with him during these moments, her quiet presence and gentle humming eventually calming his fears. Michael taught Ben about cars, letting him help in the shop's office and showing him how different engines worked, something Ben's father had never taken the time to do. Their first major hurdle came when it was time for Ben to return to school. His previous private school was on the other side of Minneapolis, and the commute would have been impossible. The local public school, Roosevelt Middle School, had a good reputation, but represented a completely different world from what Ben was used to. Emma Johnson, the music teacher at Roosevelt, played a crucial role in Ben's integration. She noticed his violin case during his first day and immediately invited him to join the school orchestra. When she discovered his exceptional talent, she began working with him during lunch breaks, helping him develop his skills further. "So you have a gift, Ben," Miss Johnson told him after one of their sessions, "and more importantly, you have the passion to make that gift shine." Ben's first few weeks at Roosevelt were challenging. Some kids stared at his wheelchair, others whispered behind his back about his famous father, and a few made thoughtless comments about his situation. But Ben had changed during his time with the Petersons. Where once he might have withdrawn into himself, he now faced these challenges with quiet dignity. The turning point came during the school's winter talent show. Ben had been practicing a particularly challenging piece, and despite his initial reluctance, Miss Johnson convinced him to perform. Sarah and Michael sat in the audience, holding hands nervously as Ben wheeled himself onto the stage. The silence that fell over the auditorium was absolute as Ben lifted his violin. The first notes of Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto filled the air, and within moments the audience was transfixed. Ben played with his eyes closed, his body swaying slightly with the music, every emotion he couldn't express in words pouring out through his instrument. When the last note faded away, there was a moment of complete stillness before the auditorium erupted in applause. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes while Michael beamed with pride. Miss Johnson, watching from the wings, saw something transformative happening. not just in how the other students viewed Ben, but in how Ben viewed himself. After the performance, several students approached Ben, genuinely interested in his music and his story. Among them was Katie Martinez, a fellow violinist who would become one of his closest friends. The walls that had separated Ben from his peers began to crumble, note by note. Spring arrived in Minneapolis, melting away the last remnants of the winter that had changed Ben's life forever. The Petersons' auto shop had undergone several transformations. Ramps had been installed, doorways widened, and a special lift system now allowed Ben to observe repairs from a safe distance when he wanted to spend time with Michael in the garage. But the biggest transformation had happened in Ben himself. Under the nurturing care of Sarah and Michael, and with Miss Johnson's musical mentorship, he was blossoming into a confident, engaging young person. His violin playing had progressed remarkably, and he had started composing his own pieces, pouring his experiences into music that moved everyone who heard it. One afternoon, as Ben practiced in the school music room, he noticed another student lingering by the door. It was Marcus Williams, a 7th grader who used forearm crutches due to cerebral palsy. Ben had seen him in the hallways but had never spoken to him. "That was beautiful," Marcus said shyly when Ben finished playing. "I always wanted to learn an instrument, but..." He gestured to his crutches with a self-conscious shrug. Ben wheeled closer to him. "What instrument would you want to play?" "Piano," Marcus replied, his eyes lighting up. "But everyone says it's impossible with my condition." The word impossible struck a chord with Ben. How many times had he heard that word himself? How many times had it been proven wrong by people who believed in him? That evening, during dinner with Sarah and Michael, Ben was unusually quiet, pushing his food around his plate thoughtfully. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, exchanging a concerned look with Michael. "I want to start a music group," Ben announced suddenly. "For kids like me and Marcus, kids who everyone says can't play music." Sarah and Michael listened as Ben outlined his vision, a program that would adapt musical instruments and teaching methods to accommodate different abilities. His eyes shone with enthusiasm as he explained how technology could help, remembering the adaptive devices Michael had introduced him to in the shop. "We could call it Different Notes, Same Song," Ben suggested, his voice growing more excited. "Miss Johnson could help teach, and maybe we could use the school music room after hours." Michael reached across the table and squeezed Ben's hand. "That's a wonderful idea, son. But it might take some money to get started. Adaptive instruments aren't cheap." "I've been saving my allowance," Ben said quickly, "and maybe we could do a fundraising concert." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. This was so different from the withdrawn boy they'd found in the snow just months ago. This Ben was full of purpose and determination to help others. With Miss Johnson's enthusiastic support, the project began to take shape. The music teacher had already been researching adaptive music education and had connections with several organizations that could help. She worked with Ben to develop a curriculum that could be adapted for various needs and abilities. The first meeting of Different Notes, Same Song attracted 5 students, including Marcus. Ben had prepared a presentation about famous musicians with disabilities, showing that physical limitations didn't have to limit artistic expression. When he demonstrated how he had learned to adapt his violin technique, the other students watched with rapt attention. Marcus discovered that with some creative positioning and adapted pedal techniques, he could indeed play the piano. A girl named Rachel, who had limited use of her hands, found she had a beautiful singing voice. Each student began to find their own way to make music, guided by Ben's patient encouragement and Miss Johnson's expertise. Word about the group spread through Roosevelt Middle School and beyond. Local news stations picked up the story, touched by the image of the former tech mogul's son using his own experiences to help others. The publicity led to donations of instruments and equipment, allowing the program to expand. But it wasn't the publicity or the donations that made Ben proudest. It was the moments when he saw his fellow musicians discover their own capabilities. Like when Marcus played his first complete piece on the piano, or when Rachel performed a solo at the spring concert. One afternoon, as Ben was helping Marcus adjust his piano bench, Sarah watched from the doorway of the music room, her heart full. Michael came up behind her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Remember when we thought the storm had trapped us in the shop?" she whispered to her husband. Turns out it was leading us exactly where we needed to be. The sound of piano and violin filled the air as Ben and Marcus practiced together, their music weaving together in perfect harmony. In that moment, Sarah realized that their little family hadn't just given Ben a home, he had given them a whole new purpose. The success of Different Notes, Same Song exceeded everyone's expectations. What had started as a small after-school group had grown into a full-fledged program with 20 students from various schools across Minneapolis. Ben, now 11, had become not just a musician but a leader, working alongside Miss Johnson to welcome each new member with understanding and encouragement. The group's first major performance was scheduled for the Minneapolis Community Arts Center, a venue that normally hosted professional musicians. The preparation consumed everyone's attention. Ben spent hours helping other students perfect their parts, showing a natural talent for teaching that surprised even Miss Johnson. "You know," Emma Johnson said one afternoon as she watched Ben work with a new student, "you remind me of my first music teacher. She never saw limitations, only possibilities." Ben smiled, adjusting the modified guitar stand he and Michael had designed for a student with limited arm mobility. "That's what Sarah and Michael taught me. They never treat me like I can't do something. They just help me figure out how to do it differently." The Petersons had indeed transformed their lives around supporting Ben's vision. Michael had become something of an inventor, creating custom instrument holders and adaptive equipment in his workshop after hours. Sarah had taken on the role of program coordinator, managing schedules and handling the growing interest from parents across the city. One morning, as Sarah was updating the program's social media page, something she'd learned to do to keep parents informed, she noticed an unusual surge in their followers. Her video of the group's rehearsal had gone viral overnight, catching the attention of a popular music blog that highlighted innovative music education programs. The comment section was flooded with messages of support. "This is incredible. Music really is universal. These kids are so talented, can't wait to see more. When's the next performance? I'd love to bring my daughter." But it was one particular comment that made Sarah's hand pause over the mouse. "Is that Benjamin Anderson, Richard Anderson's son?" The question sent a chill through her. In the months since Ben had become part of their family, Richard Anderson's name had rarely been mentioned. The legal proceedings had continued in his absence, with his lawyers handling everything while he remained abroad. The court had granted the Petersons temporary custody, with a hearing for permanent adoption scheduled for the following month. Sarah debated whether to tell Ben about the comment, but decided against it. He was flourishing, and she didn't want anything to disturb his peace. However, she did share her concerns with Michael and Miss Johnson, who agreed to keep an eye on the situation. The viral video brought unexpected attention to the program. Local businesses began reaching out with offers to sponsor their upcoming performance. A music store donated adaptive instruments, and a tech company offered to help develop an app that would make music education more accessible to students with different abilities. Ben's response to the growing attention was remarkable. Rather than becoming overwhelmed, he seemed to draw strength from the opportunity to share his message with a wider audience. During a local TV interview, he spoke with surprising wisdom about the importance of inclusive music education. "Everyone has music inside them," he told the reporter, his blue eyes intense with conviction. "Sometimes they just need help finding the right way to let it out." The reporter, touched by Ben's words, asked about his own journey with music. Ben spoke about his violin, about Miss Johnson's guidance, and about the love and support of his foster parents. He never mentioned his past or his father, focusing instead on the positive change he hoped to create. The interview aired on a Thursday evening. Sarah and Michael watched it with Ben in their living room above the auto shop, all of them cuddled together on their worn but comfortable couch. When it ended, Ben turned to them with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply, hugging them both. "For what, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, stroking his hair. "For finding me in the snow, for giving me a real home, for believing in me." Michael had to clear his throat several times before he could speak. "You're our son, Ben. We'll always believe in you." The next day at school, Ben was surprised to find himself something of a celebrity. Students who had never spoken to him before stopped to congratulate him on the interview. Teachers smiled warmly as he passed in the hallways. Even the principal called him to her office to express her pride in how he was representing Roosevelt Middle School. But the most meaningful moment came during that afternoon's Different Notes, Same Song session. Marcus, who had become Ben's closest friend, wheeled over to him before practice began. "You know what?" Marcus said, grinning. "My little sister saw the interview yesterday, and she told my parents she wants to learn music too. She has Down syndrome, and she's always been scared to try new things. But after seeing our group, she believes she can do it." Ben felt his heart swell with joy. This was exactly why he had started the program, to show others what he had learned himself, that limitations only defined you if you let them. As he looked around the music room at his fellow musicians preparing for practice, each finding their own unique way to create music, he felt a sense of purpose stronger than anything he'd ever known. The Minneapolis Community Arts Center buzzed with excitement on the evening of the Different Notes Same Song premiere performance. The concert hall, which seated 500 people, was completely sold out. Local media had set up their cameras, and the atmosphere crackled with anticipation. Backstage, Ben adjusted his bow tie in the mirror, trying to calm the butterflies in his stomach. The formal attire had been a gift from Sarah and Michael, not as expensive as the suits his father used to buy him, but chosen with love and altered specifically for his comfort in the wheelchair. "Nervous?" Miss Johnson asked, appearing beside him in an elegant blue dress, her normally casual teaching attire replaced by concert formal wear. "A little," Ben admitted, "but excited too. Everyone has worked so hard for this." The program they had prepared was ambitious. It included classical pieces adapted for their unique ensemble, popular songs arranged to showcase each musician's abilities, and several original compositions by Ben himself. The finale would feature all 20 students performing together in a piece that Ben had written specifically to highlight each person's strengths. As the performers gathered for final preparations, Sarah appeared with an envelope in her hand, her expression a mix of concern and uncertainty. "Ben, sweetheart," she said gently, "this was just delivered for you. You don't have to read it now if you don't want to." Ben recognized the expensive stationery immediately. It was from his father's company. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. Inside was a brief note written in his father's familiar handwriting. "Benjamin, I saw your interview. I'll be in the audience tonight. Dad." The room seemed to spin for a moment. Ben felt Marcus's hand on his shoulder, grounding him. Miss Johnson quickly moved to his side, while Sarah knelt in front of his wheelchair, taking his hands in hers. "You don't owe him anything," Sarah said firmly. "This is your night, your achievement. You decide what you want to do." Ben took a deep breath, looking around at his found family, Sarah and Michael, who had given him a real home, Miss Johnson, who had nurtured his talent, his fellow musicians, who had become true friends. He thought about how far he'd come from that snowy night that had changed everything. "I want to perform," he said with quiet determination. "Not for him, for us, for everything we've built together." The lights dimmed in the concert hall as Michael stepped onto the stage to introduce the program. His voice, usually more comfortable discussing car engines, carried clearly through the hall as he explained the group's mission of making music accessible to everyone. One by one, the performers took their places. Rachel's voice soared in a solo that brought tears to many eyes. Marcus, at the adapted piano, played with passionate intensity. Each student showed what was possible when talent was given the right support to shine. Then it was Ben's turn for his solo. As he wheeled onto the stage, he scanned the audience briefly and saw him, Richard Anderson, sitting in the back row, looking exactly as Ben remembered, except for a few more gray hairs at his temples. For a moment, their eyes met. Ben felt the weight of all the questions he'd carried for months. Why hadn't his father loved him enough to keep him? Why had it been so hard for him to accept Ben as he was? But as Ben lifted his violin to his chin, those questions faded away. The music he had chosen was a piece he'd composed himself, titled Finding Home. It told his story, not of abandonment, but of discovery. The melody spoke of cold nights and warm hearts, of fear transformed into courage, of a journey that had led him exactly where he needed to be. As he played, Ben closed his eyes, letting the music flow through him. He thought of Sarah's gentle hugs and Michael's patient teachings. He remembered the first time Marcus had successfully played a complete song and the joy on Rachel's face when she discovered her voice. He thought of Miss Johnson's unwavering belief in his abilities and the way his new family had shown him that love wasn't about perfection, it was about acceptance. The final notes of his solo faded into a silence so complete you could hear the beating of hearts. Then the applause began, starting slowly and building to a thunderous standing ovation. When Ben opened his eyes, he saw Sarah and Michael in the front row, tears streaming down their faces. Miss Johnson was beaming from the wings. The morning after the concert, the Minneapolis Tribune ran a glowing review of the performance, but Ben hardly noticed. His mind was still processing the events that had followed his solo. Richard Anderson had approached backstage, moving through the crowd of well-wishers with the same commanding presence Ben remembered. Sarah and Michael had immediately moved to Ben's side, their protective instincts on high alert. Miss Johnson stationed herself nearby, ready to intervene if needed. But Ben, surprising everyone including himself, remained calm and composed. "Your performance was extraordinary," Richard had said, his voice carrying a hint of uncertainty that Ben had never heard before. "The piece you wrote, it was beautiful." "Thank you," Ben replied simply, his hands folded calmly in his lap. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. Richard cleared his throat. "I've been following your progress. The program you've created, it's remarkable. I'd like to help. Anderson Innovations could provide funding, technology, whatever you need to expand." Ben felt Sarah's hand on his shoulder tighten slightly. He reached up and patted it reassuringly before addressing his father. "The program isn't about money or technology," he said quietly but firmly. "It's about understanding that everyone deserves a chance to express themselves. That's something I learned from my real family." The emphasis on those last two words wasn't lost on Richard. He glanced at Sarah and Michael, seeing for the first time the deep bond they shared with his son. The comfortable way Ben leaned into Sarah's touch, the proud smile Michael couldn't suppress, these were the marks of true family, formed not by obligation, but by choice and love. Now a week later, Ben sat in the Petersons' living room with Sarah, Michael, and their lawyer, Ms. Thompson. The adoption hearing was approaching, and Richard's sudden reappearance had added a new layer of complexity to the proceedings. "Your father's lawyers have contacted us," Ms. Thompson explained gently. "He's not contesting the adoption, but he's requesting visitation rights." Ben's hands twisted in his lap. "Do I have to decide right now?" "No, sweetheart," Sarah assured him. "This is entirely your choice, and you can take all the time you need." That afternoon, during the Different Notes Same Song session, Ben found himself distracted. Marcus noticed his friend's preoccupation and wheeled over during their break. "Want to talk about it?" Marcus asked, adjusting his piano bench. Ben smiled weakly. "How do you know when to give someone a second chance?" Marcus considered this. "You know that new piece I've been working on? I must have failed at it 100 times, but you never gave up on me. You kept saying that failing doesn't make you a failure. It's not trying that does." The wisdom in his friend's words struck Ben deeply. After practice, he asked Miss Johnson if they could talk. They sat in the empty music room, the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows. "When I first started teaching you," Miss Johnson said after listening to Ben's concerns, "you were so afraid of making mistakes that you barely played above a whisper. But you learned that music isn't about perfection. It's about expression, growth, and sometimes forgiveness." Ben nodded, running his fingers along the smooth wood of his violin case. "I'm not sure I'm ready to forgive him yet, but maybe I'm ready to listen." The next day, Ben asked Sarah and Michael to help him compose an email to his father. He chose his words carefully. "Dear Dad, I can't forget what happened, but I'm willing to talk. Not about money or business, but about music, about who I am now, and maybe about who you want to be in my life going forward. Miss Johnson has offered to let us use the music room after school next week, if you'd like to come hear me practice." "Ben." Richard's response came within an hour, accepting the invitation with a humility that seemed genuine. The scheduled day arrived, and Ben waited in the music room, his violin ready. Sarah and Michael had offered to stay, but he had asked them to wait outside. This was something he needed to do on his own. Richard arrived precisely on time, looking somewhat out of place in his expensive suit among the music stands and student artwork. Ben gestured to a chair, and without preamble began to play. He chose a piece he had been working on, one that expressed both pain and possibility. As he played, he watched his father's face reflect a range of emotions, recognition of the hurt he had caused, amazement at his son's talent, and perhaps hope for redemption. When the last note faded, Ben lowered his violin. "That's part of a new piece I'm writing," he explained. "It's about transformation, how sometimes the hardest changes lead us to where we're meant to be." Richard's eyes were damp. "Ben, he started, then stopped, seeming to struggle with words for the first time in his life. "I've made so many mistakes." "Yes," Ben agreed simply. "But Miss Johnson says that mistakes can be the beginning of something new if we learn from them." Spring turned to summer, and with it came changes both expected and surprising. The adoption was finalized, making Ben officially Benjamin Peterson, though he chose to keep Anderson as his middle name. A reminder, he said, of where he had come from and how far he had come. The Different Notes Same Song program continued to flourish. What had started in one music room in Minneapolis was beginning to spread. Schools in neighboring cities had reached out, interested in starting their own chapters. Ben and Miss Johnson spent hours developing guidelines and training materials to help other teachers implement the program. Richard Anderson had begun attending Ben's performances regularly, sitting quietly in the back. He never tried to overshadow the Petersons' role as Ben's parents, but instead found his own way to be part of his son's life. He attended parent-teacher conferences alongside Sarah and Michael, and slowly, awkwardly, began learning to see Ben for who he was rather than who he had wanted him to be. One warm Saturday afternoon, as Ben and Marcus were practicing a new duet, Richard appeared at the music room door with an unexpected proposal. "I've been thinking," he said, addressing not just Ben but the whole group. "The Community Arts Center is wonderful, but you've outgrown it. Henderson Innovations owns a building downtown with an unused auditorium. With some renovations, it could become a permanent home for the program." Ben looked at his father thoughtfully. "Would there be strings attached?" Richard shook his head. "No strings. The space would belong to the program entirely. I want to help, in whatever way you'll let me." Ben glanced at Sarah and Michael, who had become unofficial advisors to the program. They nodded encouragingly, and Ben turned to Miss Johnson. "What do you think? Could we use a bigger space?" Miss Johnson's eyes lit up. "With a proper facility, we could offer more classes, maybe even start a music therapy program. But," she added firmly, "only if it feels right to you, Ben." Ben wheeled himself to the window, looking out at the Minneapolis skyline. The city that had once felt so cold and unwelcoming had become a place of possibility. He thought about all the other kids out there who might benefit from what they had built. "Okay," he said finally, "but I have conditions." Richard leaned forward, listening intently as Ben outlined his vision. The space would need to be fully accessible with state-of-the-art adaptive equipment. There would need to be practice rooms, a recording studio, and areas for group collaboration. Most importantly, it would need to maintain the warm, welcoming atmosphere that had made their current program so successful. As summer progressed, the renovation plans took shape. Ben was involved in every aspect, from the design of the practice rooms to the selection of equipment. His experience in both the mansion he'd grown up in and the cozy apartment above the auto shop gave him unique insight into creating a space that would be both functional and comfortable. Michael contributed his expertise in adaptive equipment, working with architects to ensure every detail was considered. Sarah's organizational skills proved invaluable in coordinating the various aspects of the expansion. Miss Johnson began developing an expanded curriculum that would make use of the new facilities. The program's reputation continued to grow. A documentary filmmaker contacted them about featuring Different Notes Same Song in a series about innovative education programs. Music education journals published articles about their methods. Ben found himself being invited to speak at conferences, sharing their approach to inclusive music education. One evening, as Ben was finishing up a practice session, he found Richard standing in the doorway of the music room, watching him play. "You remind me of your mother when you play," Richard said softly. "She had that same look of complete peace." Ben was surprised. His father rarely mentioned his mother. "Do you know where she is?" Richard nodded. "She's in California. She asked about you. I told her about the program, showed her some videos of your performances." Ben absorbed this information silently, his fingers running along the strings of his violin. "Maybe someday I'll be ready to talk to her too," he said finally. "But right now I'm happy with my family here." Richard smiled, understanding that family now meant many people, Sarah and Michael, who had given Ben a home when he needed it most, Miss Johnson, who had helped him find his voice through music, Marcus and the other students, who had become like siblings, and yes, even Richard himself, slowly earning a place in his son's life through patience and genuine change. As they left the music room that evening, they could hear Marcus playing piano in one of the practice rooms, Rachel singing along, their music floating through the hallways. The sound represented everything the program had become, a place where differences were celebrated, where limitations became possibilities, and where every note contributed to a greater harmony. The new music center was everything Ben had envisioned and more. The renovated auditorium gleamed with state-of-the-art equipment, while still maintaining the warm, inclusive atmosphere that had made the original program so special. But what made Ben proudest wasn't the facilities. It was the growing community that filled them with music and life. On a crisp autumn morning, Ben sat in the center's main hall, watching as Miss Johnson conducted a video conference with teachers from Seattle, Boston, and Chicago. All three cities were preparing to launch their own branches of Different Notes, Same Song, using the curriculum and guidelines Ben and Miss Johnson had developed. Remember, Ben added after Miss Johnson finished explaining their teaching methodology, the most important thing isn't the technique, it's making sure every student feels valued and heard. The teachers nodded, taking notes. One of them, a music therapist from Boston, spoke up. Ben, the video of your last performance really inspired my students. They've been asking when you might come visit our program. Ben glanced at Sarah, who was managing their increasingly busy schedule. She gave him an encouraging smile. Actually, she said, we've been thinking about organizing a national tour. It would be a chance to connect with all the new chapters and share experiences in person. The idea of touring had been percolating for a while. The documentary about their program had aired on PBS, drawing attention from schools and music programs across the country. Letters and emails poured in daily from parents and teachers asking for advice and support. That afternoon, during a break between classes, Ben found himself in the center's recording studio with Marcus. They had been working on a collaborative piece that combined piano and violin in ways that showcased both their talents and their unique playing styles. I can't believe we might actually go on tour, Marcus said, adjusting his piano bench. Remember when we thought performing at the Community Arts Center was a big deal? Ben smiled, remembering those early days. Sometimes I still can't believe how much has changed. A year ago I was just trying to survive. Now you're changing lives, Marcus finished, including mine. The sound of footsteps made them both look up. Richard Anderson stood in the doorway, holding a tablet. Sorry to interrupt, he said, but I thought you might want to see this. He handed the tablet to Ben, showing him an email from the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. They were interested in hosting a special performance featuring students from all the Different Notes, Same Song chapters across the country. They want to make it part of their annual celebration of arts education, Richard explained. It would be broadcast nationally. Ben's heart raced as he read the details. The performance would bring together students from every chapter, creating a unique showcase of inclusive music education. It was an opportunity to show the world what was possible when barriers were removed and talent was given room to flourish. What do you think? Richard asked, watching his son's expression carefully. Ben looked around the studio, at Marcus, his first friend in the program, at the adaptive equipment he and Michael had designed together, at the wall of photos showing their growing musical family. I think, he said slowly, we're going to need a bigger piece of music. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Ben threw himself into composing a special piece for the Kennedy Center performance, one that would incorporate musicians of all abilities from across the country. Miss Johnson helped him arrange parts that could be adapted for different instruments and skill levels. Sarah and Michael watched with pride as their son worked tirelessly on the composition. In the evenings, Ben would play them segments, explaining how each part would showcase different students' abilities. His eyes shone with excitement as he described his vision for the performance. The first section represents struggle, he explained one night, demonstrating on his violin. But then it transforms into something beautiful, showing how our differences create a richer harmony. Richard, too, found ways to support the project without overshadowing it. He handled the logistics of coordinating with the Kennedy Center and arranged for video conferencing equipment that would allow all the chapters to rehearse together virtually. One evening, as Ben was working late in the studio, he received an unexpected email. It was from his mother in California. She had seen the documentary and wrote to tell him how proud she was of what he had accomplished. The message was simple but sincere, asking if he might be ready to meet when the tour brought him to Los Angeles. Ben sat with the email open for a long time, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Finally, he began to type, "I'm not ready for a meeting yet, but I'd like to send you tickets to the Kennedy Center performance. Maybe we can start there." The response came quickly, a simple "thank you, I'll be there," that carried the weight of years of absence and the possibility of future healing. As autumn deepened into winter, the music center buzzed with preparation for the upcoming tour and Kennedy Center performance. Students from Minneapolis would form the core group, with Ben and Marcus as lead performers. But the piece Ben was composing would include parts for musicians from every chapter across the country. The national tour of Different Notes, Same Song began in Seattle, where the local chapter had transformed the life of a young girl with cerebral palsy who discovered she could create beautiful music using adaptive technology. From there, they traveled to Chicago, where a boy with autism had found his voice through percussion instruments modified by Michael's designs. Each city brought new stories, new challenges, and new triumphs. Ben, who had once felt so alone in his father's mansion, now found himself at the center of a growing movement. The tour wasn't just about performances, it was about connecting with students, sharing experiences, and building a nationwide community of young musicians who refused to be defined by their limitations. Sarah managed the tour schedule with remarkable efficiency, while Michael continued to innovate new adaptive solutions for different students' needs. Miss Johnson coordinated with local music teachers, helping them implement the program's teaching methods. Even Richard contributed, using his business connections to arrange comfortable, accessible transportation and accommodation for the touring group. In Boston, they were joined by Rachel, who had flown in specially to perform with them. Her voice, which had once been confined to their small music room in Minneapolis, now filled grand concert halls. The standing ovations that followed her performances brought tears to Ben's eyes, remembering how shy she had been when she first joined the program. The Los Angeles performance was particularly emotional. Ben knew his mother was in the audience, though he had asked not to meet her yet. Instead, he poured everything he felt, the pain of abandonment, the joy of finding a new family, the power of music to heal, into his playing. After the show, she sent a bouquet of white roses with a card that read simply, "When you're ready, I'll be here." Finally, the tour culminated in Washington, D.C., where students from all the chapters gathered for the Kennedy Center performance. The rehearsal space was filled with young musicians from across the country, each with their own story of how music had changed their life. Ben wheeled through the crowd, greeting familiar faces and meeting new ones. There was David from Seattle, who played drums with his feet because he had limited use of his arms. Maria from Chicago, who had adapted her trumpet playing to work with her prosthetic hand. Tommy from Boston, who used a computer interface to compose complex orchestral pieces despite his severe physical limitations. The night before the performance, Ben gathered all the musicians together for a final rehearsal of his new composition, Voices United. The piece was unlike anything he had written before, a complex arrangement that wove together traditional instruments, adaptive technology, and voice in a celebration of diversity and possibility. "This piece isn't just about making music," Ben told the assembled musicians. "It's about showing the world that every voice matters, that every person has something unique to contribute. When we play tomorrow, we're not just performing, we're proving that limitations only exist if we accept them." The Kennedy Center performance was broadcast live on national television. The auditorium was filled with families, teachers, music industry professionals, and supporters from across the country. Sarah and Michael sat in the front row, with Richard a few seats away. Somewhere in the audience, Ben knew his mother was watching too. As Ben wheeled onto the stage to take his position as concertmaster, he remembered that snowy night in Minneapolis that had changed everything. The years since then had been a journey from abandonment to purpose, from isolation to community, from fear to confidence. The music he was about to conduct would tell that story, not just his story, but the story of every student who had found their voice through the program. The performance began softly, with Ben's violin introducing a melody that spoke of loneliness and loss. Gradually, other instruments joined in: Marcus's piano, Rachel's voice, David's drums, Maria's trumpet. Each added their own voice to the symphony, creating a tapestry of sound that grew richer with every new addition. The piece built to a powerful crescendo, with all the musicians playing together in a celebration of unity in diversity. The adaptive technologies blended seamlessly with traditional instruments, creating a sound that was both innovative and deeply moving. As Ben conducted the final movement, he could feel the energy in the room, the sense that something transformative was happening. When the last note faded away, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the audience erupted in thunderous applause. People were standing, cheering, some wiping tears from their eyes. Ben looked out at the sea of faces and saw not pity or condescension, but genuine appreciation and understanding. Later that night at the reception, Ben found himself surrounded by his extended musical family. Marcus was chatting with a representative from a music education foundation. Rachel was teaching a young aspiring singer some vocal techniques. Sarah and Michael were deep in conversation with other parents about expanding the program further. Richard approached Ben with an unusual expression on his face. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly. "Watching you tonight, I finally understood. All those years, I thought I needed to fix you, to make you fit what I thought you should be. But you were never broken. You were exactly who you needed to be, someone who could help others find their voice." The success of the Kennedy Center performance catapulted Different Notes, Same Song into the national spotlight. Major media outlets picked up the story, not just of the program's success, but of the personal journey that had inspired it. Ben found himself fielding interviews not as a victim of abandonment, but as a pioneer in inclusive music education. 1 year after the Kennedy Center performance, the program had expanded to 30 cities across the United States. The original Minneapolis Center had become a training hub, where music teachers from around the country came to learn the program's unique approach. Miss Johnson had taken on the role of National Education Director, while still maintaining her special bond with the original students. On a warm spring morning, Ben sat in the Minneapolis Center's courtyard, watching new students arrive for their lessons. The space had been designed with input from everyone in the program: wide pathways for wheelchairs, sensory-friendly quiet areas, and acoustics that made every note sound crystal clear. "Penny for your thoughts?" Sarah asked, joining him with 2 cups of hot chocolate, their traditional morning ritual. "I was just thinking about how different everything is now," Ben replied, accepting the cup. "Remember when we thought having 20 students was a big deal?" Sarah smiled, remembering those early days. "And now look at you. You're about to go to New York to accept an award from the National Endowment for the Arts." The award ceremony would recognize Ben's contributions to arts education, but he had insisted that the entire Minneapolis team attend. "It's not my award," he had said. "It belongs to all of us." The ceremony would also mark another significant moment: his first real conversation with his mother since she had attended the Kennedy Center performance. They had exchanged emails over the past year, building a cautious bridge across the years of absence. She had started volunteering with the Los Angeles chapter of the program, working with parents of newly diagnosed children. That afternoon, during a break between classes, Ben found Marcus in their favorite practice room. His friend was working on a new composition of his own. He had developed into a talented composer, creating pieces specifically designed for adaptive performance. "Have you decided what you're going to say in your speech?" Marcus asked, turning away from the piano. Ben shook his head. "I've been trying to write it for weeks. How do you sum up everything that's happened? How do you explain that something that started with so much pain could turn into something so beautiful?" "Maybe that's exactly what you should say," Marcus suggested. "Your story shows people that it's not about what happens to you. It's about what you choose to do with it." Later that day, Ben had a video call with Richard, who had become an unexpected ally in the program's expansion. His father had used his business acumen to create a foundation that supported arts education for children with disabilities, though he was careful to maintain professional boundaries and let Ben's team make all creative and educational decisions. "The New York Times wants to do a feature story," Richard told him. "They're interested in how the program is changing perceptions about disability in the arts." Ben considered this. "I'll do it on one condition. They need to focus on the students and their achievements, not just on my story." Richard nodded. a proud smile crossing his face. "You always keep us focused on what really matters." That evening, Ben sat in the center's recording studio, listening to a compilation of performances from various chapters across the country. Each piece was unique, reflecting the individual voices and abilities of the performers. There was a jazz ensemble from New Orleans that incorporated adaptive percussion, a choir from Seattle that combined sign language with vocal performance, and a string quartet from Chicago that had revolutionized how classical music could be played with prosthetic devices. Michael came in, carrying some new equipment he had been developing. "What do you think about this?" he asked, showing Ben a modified violin bow that could be controlled with minimal hand movement. "One of our new students is having trouble with grip strength." Ben examined the device, marveling at how far they had come from the early days of jury-rigged music stands in the school practice room. Michael's innovations had become an integral part of their program, with music therapy programs across the country adopting his designs. "It's perfect," Ben said, testing the bow's balance. "Have you shown this to the team in Boston? They have a student who might benefit from something similar." As they discussed the technical details, Sarah appeared in the doorway. "Ben, sweetheart, Miss Johnson wants to show you something." In the main hall, Miss Johnson was working with a new student, a 7-year-old girl named Lucy, who had been born without arms. Using one of Michael's adaptive devices, she was playing a modified keyboard with her feet, her face glowing with concentration and joy. As Ben watched Lucy play, he felt tears welling up in his eyes. He remembered his own first lessons with Miss Johnson, how she had seen past his wheelchair to the musician within. Now, that same spirit of possibility was being passed on to a new generation of students. "She reminds me of you," Miss Johnson said softly, joining Ben as Lucy continued to play. "That same determination, that refusal to believe in limitations." Ben smiled, watching Lucy hit a particularly challenging sequence of notes. "She's going to do great things," he said. "They all are." The New York Awards ceremony was held in Lincoln Center, a fitting venue for a program that had transformed the landscape of music education. The grand hallway was filled with photographs from different notes, same song chapters across the country, each telling a story of barrier-breaking achievement. Ben, now 12, sat backstage with Sarah and Michael, making last-minute adjustments to his speech. His mother had arrived earlier, greeting him with a tentative hug that he had found himself returning. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was a beginning, much like those first hesitant notes that started every great piece of music. Richard was there too, maintaining a respectful distance while clearly bursting with pride. He had spent the afternoon talking with parents from various chapters, listening to their stories and taking notes on how the foundation could better support their needs. "5 minutes, Ben," Miss Johnson called, peeking into the room. She had become not just a teacher, but a trusted mentor, helping him navigate both his musical development and his growing role as a leader in the arts education community. Marcus wheeled up beside Ben, adjusting his bow tie. "Ready to show them what we've got?" The ceremony began with a performance featuring students from across the country. Ben had composed a special piece for the occasion, titled Limitless, which incorporated elements from every chapter's signature performances. As he conducted the ensemble from his wheelchair, he could feel the energy in the room building with each measure. The performance ended to thunderous applause, and then it was time for Ben's speech. As he wheeled onto the stage, he looked out at the audience, his parents, both sets of them, sitting together in support of his achievement. Miss Johnson beaming proudly, Marcus and the other original students from Minneapolis, teachers and students from across the country, and little Lucy, who had insisted on coming to watch her hero receive his award. "When I was younger," Ben began, his voice clear and confident, "I thought my wheelchair defined who I was and who I could become. I lived in a mansion filled with everything money could buy, but I felt trapped by what I thought I couldn't do." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the audience. "Then one snowy night in Minneapolis, I found something more valuable than anything money could buy. I found people who saw me not for my limitations, but for my possibilities. Sarah and Michael Peterson didn't just give me a home, they gave me the courage to be myself. Miss Johnson didn't just teach me music, she taught me that everyone has a unique voice waiting to be heard." Ben gestured to the ensemble behind him. "Look at what we've created together. In 30 cities across this country, children who were once told what they couldn't do are discovering what they can do. They're not just making music. They're changing perceptions, breaking barriers, and showing the world that disability doesn't define ability. His voice grew stronger as he continued. Every time I hear a new student play their first note, every time I see a parent cry with joy at their child's performance, every time I watch one of our musicians discover something they never thought possible, I'm reminded of what this program is really about. It's not about creating perfect musicians. It's about creating perfect moments where limitations disappear and pure possibility takes their place. Ben looked at his families, Sarah and Michael, who had saved him and given him a home. Richard, who had learned that love meant accepting, not changing. His mother, who was finding her way back through music, and his extended musical family that filled the hall. The award I'm receiving tonight honors innovation in arts education, but the real innovation isn't in our adaptive instruments or our teaching methods. It's in the simple belief that everyone deserves the chance to make music, to be heard, to contribute their unique voice to the world's symphony. As he concluded his speech, Ben lifted his violin and began to play. Not a complex piece, but the simple melody he had first learned with Miss Johnson, the one that had shown him music could speak when words failed. The melody grew as others joined in. Marcus on piano, Rachel's soaring voice, David's drums, Maria's trumpet, Lucy's keyboard, and dozens more, each adding their unique sound to the harmony. The music filled Lincoln Center, spilling out into the New York night, carrying with it a message of hope and possibility. Later that night, at the celebration dinner, Ben found himself surrounded by the people who had helped transform his life. Sarah and Michael still looked at him with the same love they had shown on that snowy night in Minneapolis. Richard had learned to show his pride in quieter, more meaningful ways. His mother was finding her place in this expanded family. Miss Johnson was already talking about new programs they could develop. As Ben watched Lucy showing Marcus a new way she had discovered to play a difficult passage, he realized that his journey had never really been about overcoming limitations. It had been about discovering that limitations only existed if you accepted them as final. Every obstacle could become an opportunity, every challenge a chance to innovate, every difference a unique contribution to the greater harmony of life. The next morning, as they prepared to return to Minneapolis, Ben received an email from a mother in Seattle. Her daughter had just attended her first different notes, same song session and had come home saying, "Mommy, I can make music too." Ben smiled, sharing the email with Sarah and Michael. This was why they did what they did. This was what made every challenge worthwhile. Because somewhere in every city where their program had taken root, another child was discovering what Ben had learned in that small music room in Minneapolis. That music, like love, knew no limitations. As their plane took off, Ben looked down at the city below, thinking about all the possibilities that still lay ahead. The program would continue to grow, touching more lives, breaking more barriers, creating more music. And somewhere, another child who thought they couldn't would discover that they could. It was, Ben realized, just the beginning.